British Columbia contains more coastline than the entire eastern seaboard of the United States. Its interior has mountain ranges that were not fully mapped until the 20th century, river valleys that still do not have road access, and a northern wilderness so vast that an entire town could disappear into it and take years for anyone to notice, which is convenient because that is essentially what kept happening. The province was built on extraction: gold, silver, copper, timber, fish, asbestos, molybdenum. And extraction towns have a specific life cycle that British Columbia has lived through more times than almost anywhere else in Canada. You find something. You build a town around it. The company runs the town, owns the houses, runs the store, provides the school. The resource runs out, or the price collapses, or the technology changes, and then the company makes a decision that the town gets to find out about on a Tuesday. And then the town becomes whatever it becomes when 1,500 people leave in 4 months, and the buildings are left standing in a mountain valley with no road and no economic rationale and nothing but rain and time. These are 18 of the most inexplicable, most unsettling, most historically loaded places that process has left behind, alongside a few places that were always strange and never needed a resource boom to become that way. If you're new here and this is the kind of unglamorous, research-first content you've been looking for, please subscribe before we get into it. These videos go up regularly and it genuinely helps. Now let's get into the list. Number 18. Parkhurst Ghost Town, Whistler. Most people know Whistler as one of the most expensive ski destinations in North America, a resort town engineered for international tourism, with real estate values that belong to a different country than the one surrounding it. What most people do not know is that on the north shore of Green Lake, about 4 kilometers from the resort, sits a ghost town that has been slowly merging with the forest since the 1960s. Parkhurst was a logging community. In the decades when the surrounding forests were being actively harvested, the settlement made sense. When the logging moved on, the people did too. The buildings did not. What the forest did to those buildings over the 60 years since is one of the more quietly spectacular things in the Whistler corridor. Trees grow through the floors of abandoned structures. Vines cover walls. Rusted machinery sits half buried in undergrowth that has swallowed what were once cleared lots. The gap between what Whistler has become and what Parkhurst remains is a few kilometers of trail and about 6 decades of diverging histories. It is the easiest ghost town in British Columbia to visit, and one of the stranger landscapes the province has to offer. Number 17. Phoenix, Boundary Country. Phoenix called itself the highest city in Canada. Sitting in the Boundary Country just east of Greenwood in the Okanagan Highlands, it had 20 hotels, a brewery, an opera house, and a hockey team that made a legitimate run at the Stanley Cup at the turn of the 20th century. The copper beneath the surrounding landscape had drawn enough people to make that infrastructure plausible. Then the First World War ended. Copper prices collapsed when the wartime demand evaporated. The mines shut. The hotels closed. The people who had built something resembling a city in a high mountain valley were gone within a few years. What the ore pits eventually became is one of the more visually striking aftermaths on this list. An open pit mine has swallowed most of the town site, and what surrounds it is the old cemetery, where rows of headstones carry dates from 1918. Returning soldiers brought an influenza epidemic to the isolated mountain town, and the cemetery kept filling as the copper ran out. There is a cenotaph, a ski hill that never operated commercially, and the feeling of a city that came and went so fast that British Columbia never entirely processed that it had happened. Number 16. Stave Falls Powerhouse Mission. The Stave Falls Powerhouse opened in 1912, generated electricity for the Fraser Valley for nearly 90 years, and was decommissioned in 2000. What BC Hydro left behind in the Mission area is a massive early 20th century electrical generating facility with turbines the size of small houses, catwalks crossing machinery that has not moved in decades, and switchgear panels that look like something designed by an inventor who considered aesthetics inseparable from function. The Vancouver Paranormal Society has called Stave Falls the most haunted location in the Lower Mainland. There are reports of chairs repositioning themselves between visits, of a dog barking persistently from a location with no animals, of whispers in the generator rooms. Whether or not that framing is something you find persuasive, the architecture of the place earns the feeling independently. A working hydroelectric plant is an imposing structure when the machinery is running. A decommissioned one, with a century of industrial history visible in every fitting and every cable, is something more difficult to name. BC Hydro has maintained part of the site as a visitor center with interactive displays. What that visitor center sits inside makes the displays a secondary feature. Number 15. Sandon, Slocan Valley. The Slocan Valley has been called the Valley of Ghosts, and the title is not metaphorical. The entire region is dotted with the remnants of mining settlements that existed, flourished briefly, and then collapsed, some through economic failure, some through fire, some through flood. Sandon was once called North America's Monte Carlo. At its 1898 peak, Sandon held 5,000 residents, nearly 300 operating mines, 29 hotels, 3 breweries, 3 churches, and 85 brothels. A ratio that tells you something specific about the social priorities of a silver rush town in the Selkirk Mountains. The community had organized ice hockey as early as 1904. It burned partially in the early 1900s, was rebuilt, and survived until a series of floods in the 1950s destroyed what remained of the commercial core. A handful of buildings survive, including a community museum and a working hydroelectric station powered by the same creek that ran through the town when it was alive. The vintage trolley buses parked alongside the ruins belong to an entirely different era of BBC transit history and ended up here through a sequence of events too complicated to summarize. Sandon is strange in the way that places which have outlived their logic tend to be strange, still present, but operating by a completely different set of rules than the ones it was built for. Number 14. Greenwood, Canada's smallest city. Greenwood holds a municipal designation that cannot be removed, regardless of how few people live within its boundaries. Once a city, always a city, that is the rule, and Greenwood is testing it at a current population of around 700 people in a city built for thousands. The BC Copper Company smelter, opened in 1901, copper made Greenwood briefly important. Copper prices collapsed after the First World War, and the city emptied out. The second chapter of Greenwood's history is harder to look at directly. In 1942, the federal government designated Greenwood the first Japanese-Canadian internment site in the province. As many as 1,200 Nikkei people were forcibly relocated from the BC coast, removed from homes and businesses and property, and housed in Greenwood's abandoned buildings, hotels, and houses. The city that copper had emptied was refilled with people who had not chosen to come there. When the internment ended in 1945, many chose to remain rather than return to the coast, where they had lost everything. The Japanese-Canadian community that resulted from one of the more explicit human rights failures in Canadian history is part of what has kept Greenwood viable. The city has more than 60 heritage buildings. It has a courthouse, a post office, and a city hall still in active use. What it has done with its own history is more complicated than any designation can capture. Number 13. Cassiar, Northern British Columbia. Cassiar operated as a company-owned asbestos mining town for 40 years, from 1952 to 1992, in the Cassiar Mountains north of Dease Lake. At its height, it held 1,500 residents, 2 schools, 2 churches, a hospital, a theater, a swimming pool, a hockey rink, everything required to keep a population stable enough to work. When the market for asbestos collapsed and the company went into receivership, the residents were given notice to vacate and the town was auctioned. Most of the buildings were bulldozed and burned. The houses that could be moved were sold and trucked south. A Catholic church still stands. The tram line that transported ore from the mine down to the mill is still visible. Flowers bloom in the cleared lots where the houses were. What is not visible but is present throughout the site in a less metaphorical sense is asbestos itself, a material that the mine produced in enormous quantities and that the town was saturated with during its operational years. Former residents have held reunions on the site, requiring special access permissions from the company that now owns it. Many of those former residents have cancer. The reunion rolls are shorter every year. Number 12. Britannia Mine, Howe Sound. For 30 years, in the early 20th century, Britannia Mine on the shores of Howe Sound was the largest copper mine in the British Commonwealth. The mountainside above Britannia Beach was honeycombed with tunnels. The town built on the slope to house the workers was a full company community, elevated above the water, with all the infrastructure required to keep thousands of people functioning in a coastal mountain environment. The mine closed in 1958. The highway linking Vancouver to Squamish opened the same year, and suddenly the isolation that had made the company town necessary was gone. The buildings came down in the 1960s. What remains is the mill complex, one of the largest concentrations of historic industrial mining architecture remaining in British Columbia, and decades of contamination that leached acid mine drainage into Howe Sound at rates that devastated marine life in the surrounding waters for generations. A remediation project has significantly reduced the acid drainage, and Howe Sound has been recovering. The mill is now a museum. The tunnels, the head frames, the mill machinery scaled to the ambition of the mine's peak production years. All of it constitutes one of the more extraordinary industrial artifacts anywhere in Western Canada. Number 11. Barkerville Caribou. In its brief peak, Barkerville was the largest city west of Chicago and north of San Francisco. Gold in Caribou Creek drew men north from California in the 1860s, and the town that formed around the discovery was the kind of place that the gold rush created with specific speed and specific excess. Saloons, brothels, merchants, gamblers, churches, a Chinatown, hotels, a theater, all of it constructed in wood in a mountain valley as fast as supply chains to the coast allowed. Then the gold ran out. The population that had packed the boardwalks thinned and kept thinning. By the early 20th century, Barkerville was a ghost of what it had briefly been. The provincial government eventually designated it a historic site and began restoration. Today, roughly 125 original and restored buildings survive, making Barkerville one of the most complete preserved gold rush townscapes anywhere in North America. What makes it genuinely strange rather than simply historical is the combination of meticulous preservation and complete emptiness beyond the tourist season. A city built for thousands, preserved for thousands more to walk through, but inhabited by almost nobody. A stage set for a play that ran for 6 years and has been maintained for the audience ever since. Number 10. Bradian, Bridge River Valley. 2 hours north of Whistler, the Brelorne gold and silver mines produced 4 million ounces of gold and over 1 million ounces of silver between 1931 and 1970, one of the highest grade operations in Canadian mining history. Bradian was the town built to house the workers. When the mine closed in 1971, the town emptied fast. Buildings disappeared faster than anyone recorded. Dismantled by neighbors for materials absorbed by the forest, collapsed under snow. By the 1990s, a private family had purchased the entire remaining town site for $100,000 and spent years re-roofing the 22 surviving structures at their own cost. The property eventually listed for close to $1 million. Dozens of inquiries arrived. Tours were arranged. Buyers investigated seriously, ran the numbers on what infrastructure investment would actually cost in a remote mountain valley 2 hours from services, and quietly withdrew. A Chinese investment group briefly looked serious before provincial regulatory requirements ended the transaction. Bradian has been available for years. The 22 houses, the mountain scenery, the isolation, and the gap between what the photographs communicate and what actually living there would require remain precisely what they were when the last mine worker left. Number 9. Ocean Falls, Central Coast. Ocean Falls receives roughly 4,390 millimeters of rain per year. The residents who remain there, somewhere between 35 and 70, depending on the season, are called the Rain People. The name is not a complaint. It is a point of pride for a community that has stayed in one of the most isolated, inhabited locations in British Columbia long after every economic rationale for being there has dissolved. The Bella Coola Pulp and Paper Company established operations here in 1909, drawn by an extraordinary natural harbor, and the hydroelectric potential of the waterfall from which the town takes its name. At its 1950s peak, Ocean Falls held 3,500 people, an Olympic-sized swimming pool that trained competitive swimmers to genuinely world-class standards, a bowling alley, a dance hall, a golf course, a hotel that was among the largest in the province, and a 5-story apartment block. Crown Zellerbach closed the mill in 1973. The provincial government bought the town site for minimal cost and kept the mill running until 1980, before the economics of the aging facility made further operation impossible. The apartment block from the 1950s has been in various states of decay since. The Martin Inn, built in 1958 and named after a mill executive, has been abandoned for decades. You get there by boat or seaplane. There is no other way. Number 8. Antiochs Observatory Inlet. Antiochs is described by researchers as possibly the largest ghost town in British Columbia by peak population, which is saying something given what this list has covered. The Granby Consolidated Mining Company began building here in 1912 around a massive copper, gold, and silver deposit on Observatory Inlet, 60 kilometers south of Stewart, with no land connection to anything. You still get there only by boat or float plane. At its peak, 2,500 people lived at Antiochs, with a hospital, machine shops, a curling rink, the first wooden tennis court built in Canada, a golf course, and the largest dam in the province when it was completed in 1914. The Great Depression crushed copper prices, and the mine shut in 1935. Salvage crews stripped the steel and machinery in the 1940s. 2 lightning strike forest fires in 1942 and 1943 burned every wooden structure to the ground. What remains at Antiochs is concrete. The industrial shells of buildings that nothing flammable is left inside, the hydroelectric infrastructure, the ghost of an engineering project that was genuinely remarkable for its era, slowly being consumed by the coastal rainforest at a pace that satellite images taken a decade apart make visible. Charter, access only. Private property. Increasingly, nothing. Number 7. Tranquil Sanatorium, Kamloops. Built in 1907 as a tuberculosis hospital on fertile land along the Thompson River west of Kamloops, Tranquille was one of those early 20th century institutions designed around the idea that fresh air, productive labor, and a clean agricultural environment were the best treatment for consumption. Patients farmed the grounds. The site was self-sustaining in a way that made it feel, from the outside, almost rural and ordinary. More than 1,500 people died there during the tuberculosis era. When antibiotics made sanatoriums obsolete, Tranquille converted to a psychiatric institution in 1959, relieving overcrowding at Riverview. It closed permanently in 1983 after a 3-week staff protest over patient care conditions. A juvenile detention facility briefly occupied the site. Before that, 2 closed in the early 1990s. An Italian developer bought the land and announced plans to build a resort called Padova City. He went bankrupt. The province took the land back. The buildings sat. Underground tunnels that connected the various structures remain, and the network of those tunnels is what most visitors describe as the defining feature. The institutional underworld of a facility that spent 80 years housing people society did not know what to do with. Number 6. Kitsault, Alice Arm. Phelps Dodge spent approximately $250 million building Kitsault in 1979. The town was engineered for 1,200 residents at the head of Alice Arm, 90 kilometers of gravel road from Terrace, a community of houses, apartments, a shopping mall, a swimming pool, a bowling alley, a pub, a curling rink, a hospital. Everything required to make a remote northern BC fjord feel like a place where a family could build a life. The molybdenum mine it was built to serve was supposed to run for 25 years. In November 1982, 18 months after the first families moved in, molybdenum prices collapsed. The mine shut. By July 1983, the last 2 residents had received eviction notices. The company kept the heat on and the power running to protect the structures. Ownership passed through several mining companies, each waiting for molybdenum prices to justify reopening. In 2005, a Virginia businessman purchased the entire town for approximately $6 million. He has spent roughly $500,000 annually maintaining it since. He has announced plans that have shifted between eco-resort, intellectual community hub, and LNG terminal. None have materialized. The carpets in the houses were vacuumed recently. The names are still on the scoreboard at the sports center. The town is currently 1983 and has been continuously 1983 for over 40 years. Number 5. Riverview Hospital, Coquitlam. Established on 1,000 acres of hillside overlooking the Fraser River in 1904, Riverview was not merely a hospital. It was a world. Farms on the grounds, 80 buildings across 244 acres, its own infrastructure, its own logic. At its 1950s peak, over 4,300 patients lived there. The first permanent ward opened in 1913 and treated what the institution described as the most disturbed patients in the province. Deinstitutionalization began emptying the wards through the 1980s and 1990s, sending patients into community programs that were chronically underfunded. By 1998, the government had announced closure plans. It took until 2012. Reports in the final years confirmed electroshock therapy still in use in the 21st century, and allegations of patient sterilization without consent followed. The West Lawn Pavilion, the most photographed of the grand brick ward buildings, with its columns and its caged verandas, has been abandoned since 1983. Underground tunnels connect the buildings. The 244-acre complex has appeared in dozens of film and television productions specifically because its deteriorating institutional architecture is unreproducible. BC. Housing now controls the land. Development plans are ongoing. A new mental health facility opened on part of the site in 2021. The brick wards of the early 20th century are still waiting. Number 4. Cassiar Asbestos Mine, Tailings. No, the BC Penitentiary, New Westminster. Canada's oldest federal penitentiary opened in New Westminster in 1878 and held inmates for over a century before closing in 1980. It was not a facility with a quiet history. A riot in 1976 lasted 11 hours and caused extensive damage. A hostage-taking in 1975 lasted 40 days. The prison earned a reputation that went beyond its architecture, and its architecture was already significant. A Victorian-era stone fortress that was built to communicate the weight of the state's authority through its physical mass. After closure, the complex sat in the kind of institutional limbo that follows when a building is too historically significant to demolish without controversy and too expensive to repurpose without commitment. Parts of the site have been redeveloped over the decades. What remains of the original structure carries the particular atmospheric density of a place that held enormous quantities of human suffering for a very long time. A century of confinement leaves something in the walls that renovations do not entirely resolve. Former staff and historians note that the site's full documentation remains incomplete. Records from the earlier decades are partial, and the full accounting of what happened inside over a century of operation has not been assembled in any single comprehensive form. Number 3. Cassiar, actually, Tashme, Sunshine Valley. Tashme was the largest Japanese-Canadian internment camp in Canada. It sat just outside the 100-mile exclusion zone drawn along the BC coast, from which all people of Japanese ancestry were forcibly removed after Pearl Harbor in 1941. The location was chosen precisely because it was just outside that arbitrary line, a technicality of geography that allowed the government to argue the camp was not within the restricted zone, while housing 2,400 people in conditions that the word camp does not adequately describe. The site had previously been a Depression-era relief workers' camp. Men interned at Tashme were put to work constructing the Crow's Nest Highway running between Hope and Manning Park, forced labor for infrastructure that served the province. The camp operated until the end of the war. After 1945, the land was sold and the site has continued in several different forms through the decades since. Today, it is an unincorporated settlement called Sunshine Valley. A Tashme Friendship Garden in Hope memorializes the camp and its residents. The highway that internees built carries tens of thousands of vehicles per year. The names of the people who built it are not on any sign visible from the road. Number 2. Esgang Gwai, Haida Gwai. Esgang Gwai is the most remote, the most ancient, and the most quietly devastating place on this list. The abandoned Haida village of Skangwe Lanagai sits on Anthony Island at the southern tip of the Gwai Hanas archipelago. Accessible only by water or aircraft from the northern part of the islands, and even then requiring days of travel by zodiac or kayak through open Pacific water. The Haida people lived at Skangwai for thousands of years. The refuse heaps of shells accumulated to 2 meters deep around the village over millennia of occupation. The cedar longhouses, the mortuary poles, the carved posts bearing the genealogical histories of powerful families. These were among the finest examples of Northwest Coast art and architecture existing anywhere. The village held around 300 people when the epidemics of the 19th century arrived. Smallpox, measles, and other introduced diseases moved through Haida Gwaii at a rate that the word devastating inadequately describes. By the 1880s, the population of Skangwai had been eliminated. By the turn of the century, only the structures remained, and the survivors on other parts of Haida Gwaii were too few and too devastated to return and maintain them. UNESCO designated Skangwai a World Heritage Site in 1981. The Haida Watchman program places guardians at the site from May through September. The totem poles are being allowed to decay and return to the earth, as Haida tradition requires, which means every visit is to a site that has less visible than it did 5 years before. There will be almost nothing left of what stands today within another generation. What happened at Skangwai, the erasure of a civilization that had occupied those islands for 10,000 years, accomplished through introduced disease in the space of a few decades, is not a mystery in the sense that it is unexplained. It is explained. The explanation is simply too large and too direct to sit with comfortably. Number 1. Kutsi-Mateen Valley. No, the Doukhobor village at Brilliant, BC. Actually, number 1 belongs to the Woodlands School, New Westminster. Woodlands opened in 1878 as the provincial home for the care of the mentally ill, and what the era called the feeble-minded. It grew across the following century into an institution of enormous scale, thousands of acres of grounds, dozens of buildings, and at its peak a population of several thousand residents with intellectual disabilities, physical disabilities, and mental illness, all housed together under a single institutional umbrella. What happened at Woodlands across its operational years? Abuse documented by survivors, residents used for pharmaceutical and medical trials without consent, deaths that were not investigated, conditions that inspectors periodically noted but that the institution continued regardless, constitutes one of the largest and least publicly examined institutional abuse records in BC history. The institution closed in 1996. A class action lawsuit by survivors resulted in a provincial apology and settlement. The main building, a vast Victorian structure that had been the institutional center of the complex for over a century, was demolished in 2008 over the objections of survivors who argued that its preservation was necessary for any genuine reckoning with what it had contained. What remains on the New Westminster site is a partial footprint, some surviving buildings incorporated into redevelopment, and a formal memorial garden. What is not there is any easy way to understand how a facility of that size operated for that long, doing what it did, with what limited external accountability, in what is now one of the most densely populated parts of the Lower Mainland. The buildings came down. The records are partial. The survivors who are still living are aging. The full account of what happened inside those walls across 118 years of operation has not been assembled in any form that matches the scale of what occurred. If this made you look at the map differently, leave a comment on which place surprised you most. Like if you want more hidden content, and subscribe so you catch the next one. Thank you for watching.